Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation on Charlotte Salomon. My name's David Brown, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Leo Baeck Institute, which is, if this is your first time attending a Leo Baeck Institute event, we are a library and archive based in the Center for Jewish History in Manhattan, where we would be having an event like this in our auditorium in normal times. But right now we're based on the World Wide Web, but we have very large collections, archival collections, library collections of materials related to the long history of Jewish people in German-speaking countries. And you can find us on www.lbi.org if you're interested in learning more. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you next Dr. Michael Riff, who is the director of the Gurs Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Ramapo College, our partner in putting on this event, and who actually conceived the event and brought it to us. We're very happy to be working with you today, Michael, and with the Gurs Center. And I also want to acknowledge the Carnegie Hall Festival, Voices of Hope, and this event is a part of that festival. And if you didn't hear about the event through the festival, I urge you very much to go to the Carnegie Hall website, where you'll find dozens and dozens of fascinating programs like this presented by Carnegie Hall and other institutions throughout New York City. So I'm looking very much forward to this conversation, and Michael, I'll let you introduce our esteemed panelists. So thank you all for joining, and we'll see you later.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Leo Baeck Institute, New York, and also Carnegie Hall's Festival of Voices of Hope for making our conversation between Griselda Pollock and Kerry Wallach happen in this glorious way. Although the conversation will mainly focus on the work of the remarkable Berlin-born Charlotte Salomon, you will also be introduced to the work and career of another outstanding artist, Rahel Szalit-Marcus, who hailed from Eastern Europe, but was an active participant in the art world of Weimar Berlin. And now let me briefly introduce Doctors Pollock and Wallach. Griselda Pollock is Professor Emerita of Social and Critical Histories of Art, Director of the Center for Cultural Analysis, Theory, and History, and a member of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. As a feminist art historian and cultural analyst, she has written extensively on art and film made by artist women. She is author of the first major art historical monograph on the remarkable work of Charlotte Salomon, published by Yale University Press in 2018. Her next book will be a study of New York painters Lee Krasner and Helen Frankenthaler. In 2020, she was awarded the Holberg Prize for her work, the first art historian to receive this extremely prestigious award. Kerry Wallach is Associate Professor of German Studies and an affiliate of the Jewish Studies program at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. She received her PhD in Germanic languages and literatures from the University of Pennsylvania in 2011. Her research focuses on 20th century German Jewish literature, history, film, visual culture, and gender. Much of her work deals with the cultural contributions of Jewish women. Her first book, Passing Illusions, Jewish Visibility in Weimar Germany, was published in 2017 and explores instances when Jewishness was concealed, revealed, and contested. She is currently completing a book that rediscovers the forgotten work and career of Rahel Szalit-Marcus. Before we begin, I just wanted to make you aware that you have an opportunity to take part in Q&A following the conversation by using the function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. What will happen is that I will convey your questions to Griselda Pollock and Kerry Wallach afterwards, so please do take part in that way. And now, Griselda and Kerry, the mics and screens are all yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and to everyone else who helped organize this event. I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm going to begin with a brief presentation, and then Griselda is going to follow me with a brief presentation, and then we'll have a more informal conversation. So that's our structure for today. What you're here for is a conversation about Jewish women and modern art. And it may seem a little bit unusual to begin an event on Charlotte Salomon by talking about a different artist, but I'd like to suggest that a close look at artists who came before Salomon will help us understand the German Jewish cultural milieu in which Salomon grew up and was trained as an artist. Like Salomon, Rahel Szalit-Marcus lived in Berlin until fleeing to France in the 1930s. And whereas Charlotte Salomon has already become a recognized name thanks to the work of feminist scholars over the last few decades, Rahel Szalit-Marcus is not yet well known. And this is in part because many of Szalit's works were destroyed when her Paris studio was plundered in 1942, and she was deported to Auschwitz via Drancy. I've been researching Szalit for over 12 years, and I hope to help write her back into art history. So I'm going to share my screen now. Does that look okay? Rahel Szalit was both a painter and an illustrator, and I think that might also shed light on Charlotte Salomon's work today. And my goal today is to think about how we can place both Rahel Szalit and Charlotte Salomon with respect to Jewish art. Women artists often go overlooked in this field in particular. And we can think of Jewish art as works that incorporate biblical or Jewish themes or connect to experiences from the Jewish past or present, including the condition of perpetual wandering, which would include emigration and exile. Rahel Szalit was an East European Jew who migrated westward in pursuit of personal and artistic freedom. Her family migrated within the Russian Empire from a Lithuanian shtetl to Łódź, which is today in Poland. And she then courageously left Eastern Europe behind in 1910 to study art in Munich, and then she moved to Berlin in 1916. So it's worth noting that Rahel Szalit was a full generation older than Charlotte Salomon, and all of Szalit's surviving work was created in Weimar, Berlin, before she went into exile in France. The painting that you see here is Szalit's The Town Musicians from 1920. It's an oil painting of East European Jewish subjects created in an expressionist style. This painting recalls works by contemporary artists such as Marc Chagall and Manet Katz, who also depicted small-town Jewish life and were eventually based in Paris. In both of these paintings, the musicians have sallow green faces and are positioned in front of a small town. Both incorporate folkloric motifs with a sense of melancholy. Other images that Szalit created of East European Jewish culture also take inspiration from small-town shtetl life. We see crowded fairs and markets, harrowed men journeying to see a rabbi, subjects struggling to get their bearings on narrow roads lined with closely packed houses. In some cases, female subjects look out and invite the viewer to identify with their position. Szalit knew and interacted with Jewish expressionists Jakob Steinhardt and Ludwig Meidner, who were also active in Weimar, Berlin. She was one of many Jewish artists who worked on illustrated books in the early 1920s, including Steinhardt, Hermann Struck, and Josef Budko. She was born Rachel Marcus in 1888, and was briefly married to actor Julius Szalit, who died by suicide in 1919. Starting in 1924, she signed her work Rahel Szalit or R. Szalit. She also taught fencing and drawing to earn a living. And here you see several self-portraits of her, including one of her as a fencer. By the late 1920s, Szalit painted herself as a new woman type with a modern approach to career, sport, and gender and sexuality. So I would like to argue that Rahel Szalit was the most important East European Jewish woman artist in Weimar, Germany. In the 1920s, numerous art historians and critics considered Szalit to be the best modern female illustrator of her time. Szalit was well known in Berlin Jewish circles, and so I'm wondering, perhaps it was possible that Charlotte Salomon was familiar with Szalit's work, which continued to be shown in Jewish circles in Germany even after 1933. Most of Szalit's lithographic book illustrations were created during the inflation period of the early 1920s, which saw a surge in bibliophilic book production. She illustrated Russian literature in German translation, including Dostoevsky's The Crocodile and Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata. And she also illustrated French and English literature in German translation, Tillier's My Uncle Benjamin and Dickens's Sketches by Boz. Many of Szalit's images focused on female characters and put women's experiences front and center. Here you see some examples from some of her best-known Jewish-themed works, illustrations of Yiddish literature by Sholem Aleichem and Mendele Mocher Sforim that feature exaggerated, even grotesque images. And on the right, you see two illustrations that accompanied Heinrich Heine's poem Princess Sabbath in a reprint of his Hebrew Melodies. One interesting point of connection between Rahel Szalit and Charlotte Salomon is graphic artist and professor Ernst Böhm. Szalit collaborated with Böhm and calligrapher Franziska Baruch on this illustrated Hebrew children's book by Chaim Nachman Bialik in 1923. This book is called Ketina Kol Bo, and it was published by the Rimon Publishing Company for Bialik's 50th birthday celebration in Berlin in 1923. Böhm created the lighthearted ornamental drawings surrounding Baruch's ancient-looking text. Szalit contributed the two lithographs that you see here on the left. And on the right, you also see a cover of the Yiddish art and letters magazine Milgroim. This cover was also created by Böhm and Baruch and was inspired by Jewish imagery drawn from medieval illuminated manuscripts and East European synagogue paintings. Charlotte Salomon also later studied briefly with Ernst Böhm in the 1930s, and thus was trained in illustration by someone who worked with Rahel Szalit and had been active in the Jewish art world of Weimar, Germany. In the late 1920s, Szalit created different kinds of illustrations for periodicals, and especially for the Jewish press. At the top of this screen, you can see a decorative travel-themed image that was published above vacation advertisements in the Zionist newspaper Jüdische Rundschau. She also illustrated short stories in the Jewish press, including a few that she wrote herself. And so you can see some of the illustrations she created for those stories here that relate to Jewish holiday observance: Purim, Passover, Yom Kippur, and Hanukkah. Like many modernist artists, Szalit loved to portray animals, especially their movements. She took inspiration from her visits to the Berlin Zoo. And here you can see on the left, she used interesting captions to add humor to some of her images. And we're not entirely sure, but we can assume that she wrote the captions herself. So it's interesting to think about the interplay between text and image in some of her work. Many of Szalit's works from the late 1920s focused on women. She depicted a wide range of experiences, from women's more traditional roles to experiences of parties and nightlife. Some of her works were more in line with the realistic art movement, New Objectivity, the Neue Sachlichkeit, which emphasized portraits. In 1927, Szalit joined the Association of Women Artists in Berlin, the Verein der Künstlerinnen zu Berlin. And notably, she participated in their 1929 exhibition, The Woman of Today, Die Frau von heute, which showed portraits of women by women and showcased the talents of 65 female artists. Szalit's painting on the left here Emigrant Woman as Barmaid, Die Emigrantin als Bardame, was one of 6 paintings that won a prize of 100 marks. This painting of a stylish, working emigrant woman serving cocktails and pub fare made quite a splash and contributed to building Szalit's international reputation. The last slide that I will show today includes the work of other women artists who were active at this time. And here you see works by Julie Wolfthorn, Lotte Laserstein, and Käthe Kollwitz, who all exhibited in the Woman of Today exhibition along with Szalit. And on the right, you see an image by Else Lasker-Schuler, who's the only Jewish woman usually mentioned in conjunction with German Expressionism. So Szalit was compared with Käthe Kollwitz because they both created lithographs with socially conscious subject matter. Kollwitz knew and supported Rahel Szalit's work in Weimar, Germany. Charlotte Salomon, as Griselda will tell us, was also familiar with Kollwitz's work and may have known her personally. So it's another point of connection between the two artists. So just to briefly conclude, Charlotte Salomon may have been inspired by Rahel Szalit and other modern artists, many of whom were Jewish and understood their work with respect to a tradition of Jewish art. Szalit and Salomon were both Jewish women artists whose projects were linked in many ways to the experiences of Jews in Germany and beyond. And with that, I'd just like to thank all of those who have supported my research on Rahel Szalit, which I'm currently completing. And now I'd like to turn it over to Griselda Pollock to tell us more about Charlotte Salomon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kerry, for that really fascinating and incredibly in-depth presentation of this wonderful artist coming back into view and being part of a much richer, in-depth presentation of the presence of Jewish women and of women in general in the creation of modern art. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope everybody can see that. And hope everybody can hear me. There's some problem of the sound coming up from the UK. When I wrote my book about Charlotte Salomon, I wanted to call it The Nameless Artist in the Theatre of Memory, and then Charlotte Salomon's Life for Theatre, Leben oder Theater. The publisher said it's impossible for me to do that because, of course, any artist is an artist's name. And you can't have a nameless artist and then say this is going to be a significant one. But it is a very significant element because she never exhibited in her lifetime. She did not belong to any organizations. She hardly had left art school, and nobody wrote about her work during her life. So she doesn't count in art historical terms conventionally as an artist. So it sort of sets against the professionalism and the organizational participation of Rahel Szalit, but nonetheless, it's interesting. Now, I would like to make a second point, which is Charlotte Salomon has become a kind of Anna Frank figure, another tragic young woman who was murdered in Auschwitz, as you see from the Stolperstein. I want to undo that in my work. I do not think she is the figure of this work. I think the work is a hugely important, monumental work of Jewish art that's made in this period, but it made not because of the tragedy of the woman, but because of the brilliance of the woman. And I identify her as a number of characters in her own world. She was a maternally bereaved child. Her mother died when she was about 9. She grows up as a socially excluded adolescent in the kind of social death inflicted on the Jewish world, as Marion Kaplan describes it. She's an exiled young adult in France, which is first under Italian control. You can see from that Nice is actually under Italian, not French, and Pétainiste control until the Germans take over in 1943. She's the witness to a psychotic breakdown and suicide. She herself declares and indicates that she contemplated it. But what we should remember is a painter who created this unique work called Leben oder Theater, Life or Theater, made in France, possibly begun in 1940, really undertaken 41, finished in 42, and revised in 43. But of course, we then mourn her as a murdered Jewish woman who was destroyed aged 26, as Mary Feldsteiner argues, for the sole reason that this healthy 26-year-old was pregnant and she was a bearer of the Jewish future. And as all women in that situation were killed immediately on arrival. So we are in mourning for what was lost. by this artist never growing up to deliver the full basis of her work. We have some remnants of her work before she made Leben, oder, Theater. She's a fine portraitist. She's a great draftsperson. She is a wonderful illustrator of stories like The Death and the Maiden. She's a fine landscape painter. But that is not for what she's known. She grew up in a world of intellectual Jewish bourgeoisie. She knew Leo Beck, he came to the house. She knew Kurt Singer, she knew Albert Einstein, she knew Alfred Schweitzer, she knew Max Liebermann, who was the head of the Academy, the famous painter, Käthe Kollwitz. She knew of Elske Lasker Schuler. I think she listened to Walter Benjamin on the radio in childhood. But the most important thing, which obviously you can't see because I'm going to reduce that so you don't see that, is through her stepmother, Paula Lindberg, Paula Levy, as she was born Lindberg, to being able to perform in Germany. And then she married Albert Salomon, who was an opera singer and a resistance fighter. She was in the resistance, and fortunately, through the power of her voice, she survived, as did Albert Salomon, her husband. Now, Leben, oder, Theater is very, very confusing because it's a single work. One work, 784 paintings, 250 transparent overlays, and 29 painted texts. Now, what is it? It's divided into these three sections: a prologue, a main part, an epilogue. The prologue is in acts, as if it's an opera or a play. The main part is in chapters, as if it's a book. And then the final part has no divisions, and I call it the indictment or the explanation for why this whole work had to be undertaken, and we'll see why. When you imagine exhibiting this work, how do you think? So the first exhibition was 1961. The work was given to her surviving parents. They didn't know what it was. They saw all these paintings. They were a bit horrified by some of the pictures and the stories. It was only ever exhibited in its entirety in the Amsterdam Jewish Museum, where it lives now. As you can see, it's a very complicated work. These are gouaches, which are the size of a large sort of drawing notebook. They're not vast paintings, but there are 780 of them. Some of them are very detailed with different kinds of multiple images and different registers. As they go on, they become more free floating. In a letter that has been recently rediscovered after coming back into the surface that we didn't know existed, we don't actually have the full original, she presented this as a gift to the person to whom she wrote the letter. And in the letter, she explains, there I was, it was summer, there were trees and sky, I saw nothing else, only colors, paintbrush and you. And this, people everywhere became too much for me. I had to go further into solitude, completely away from all humanity. Then maybe I could find what I had to find, namely myself, a name for me. And this is how I began life with theater. So this is one of the explanations. This person whose, for instance, identity has been eroded, she's in exile, she's bereaved, she has witnessed terrifying things and may or may not have been taken to a concentration camp or some kind of internment. But this is what she thinks she's doing. But again, going back to what it is, we have 4 introductions to life with theater, a playbill, which tells us it's a musical play. It has a dedication to a non-Jewish rescuer who provided the safety in which she was able to live in exile. It has a Brechtian cast list with characters, Knara, Dr. Kahn, Pauline Kabimbam, Dr. Sing Sang, Professor Kling Klang. All of these are crucial figures, as well as a character called Amadeus Dabalon. So we're meant to think of them not as people, not a biography. These are not the people in her life. These are recasting them. But then we have a memory page. Sorry, I'll go back one. A memory page which carries echoes of the Yitzkor service from the liberal, the German liberal liturgy for Yom Kippur. And at the same time says, I can't remember why I made this. I can't remember the tunes or the words, but I'm delivering it to you. Now, in terms of characters, there are several masculinities, one of which I call the monster, who is one of the central monstrous figures of this book, which indicates in this amazing drawing of it that she was painting of this monster going down a domestic apartment with a little child running between its legs with its great groping arms, evokes one of the great films of German expressionist cinema, Murnau's Nosferatu. And then there is the prophet, the teacher, the prophet of song, who is also the lover, who is the masculinity that dominates the main part, which has 467 paintings about the encounter with this character, who is also the lover of the other major feminine figure, who is these two are the voices of hope, the beloved, who is the golden voice. The prophet lectures about how to survive traumatic experience are detailed in a number of different types of painting. Some of them are word by word, page after page, 20 pages to articulate as if she's reciting verbatim the memory of the teaching he shared with her. And on the other side of this is the fact that he is a Nietzschean. He is a passionate advocate of Nietzsche's idea, and this is where you get your voice of hope. Learn to sing, oh my soul, which is why voice and music becomes so important, and this is the philosophical frame. And on the left, you're looking at a painting which she did not include in Leben, oder, theater, but it does exist from that scene, which is one of the characters, the mother character, Franziska Kahn, has a reading group for the German Jewish bourgeoisie in Berlin in 1925. And this is Munch's portrait of Nietzsche. On the other side, we have the voice, and I'm hoping this is going to work. You must have the acoustic dimension, because this is an operatic work. We are meant to sing things or hear voices. That is actually Kathleen Ferrier singing this Bach, no longer Bach chorale. If you are with me, gladly will I go to my death. But Paula Lindberg there is a recording of her. And the other one is here, which is one of the things that the Kulturbund could perform. The Jüdische Kulturbund, the group of organization for Jewish artists that was formed by Kurt Singer, they were allowed to perform Austrian artists, so Gluck and Mozart. And this opera was one that Paula Lindberg performed in. Amadeus Darbolohn is also an advocate of cinema, and must remember that Charlotte Salomon came of age in silent cinema, in the beginning of color cinema, and also sound cinema. And so musicals are not only the grand opera, but musicals play a part. And she also invokes cabaret songs like Friedrich Hollander's and others. But the other side of life and or theater, Leben oder theater, is that it's about death. It's asking the question, why do women kill themselves? Why have their lives become unlivable? Should I join them? So this is the darkness of it. And there are two sisters, both of whom are shown to take their own lives, one of whom is the mother of the Charlotte character in this opera. And in fact, the painting which she puts at the very end shows the painter that she is sitting beside the sea, searching for a name, laying in the darkness that will be the night scene of this 1913 painting at the left, which is in fact the first image. And therefore, Life or Theatre, Leben oder Theater begins with this question: why did a 16-year-old girl leave her parents' house in the middle of the night, clutching her belly, and go and drown herself in the Schlachtensee, one of these holiday lakes on the edges of Berlin? But it's even worse, and I warn you for this. She tracks and feels obliged as a painter to imagine the death of her mother, to imagine the depression, to imagine the moment at which she seeks to get up, and you see here her being looked after by a nurse, getting up, going to the window, and then the painting itself gapes, and all you see is the trailing foot. It is a jump. And one of the most striking things about this work is Charlotte Salomon paints for herself the sight of the broken body, the disjointed limbs, the bloody pool that was her mother, but she covers it with these overlays and winds this beautiful line of music from Die Freischütz by Weber, from the bridal wreath, which is the musical motif we're meant to hear all the way through the paintings of Franziska Kann. She caresses the body and decides its form. In fact, the first psychotic suicide she witnesses, and I'm not saying psychotic judgmentally, I'm talking about the intensity of the psychological collapse of the woman before she committed it, was in fact the one you see in the middle on the right, which was she witnessed, she paints herself witnessing it in Nice when her grandmother committed suicide. The grandmother committed suicide. And I've mounted this up because this death of the mother, which you've seen at the top three, was repeated in a second telling inside the memory of the woman you see in the middle three, which has a kind of cinematic shot, reverse shot structure. And then you have this third painting, which does not produce a body. If I line them up in this structural way, what is different about that is it is not in Berlin, it is not on the streets of Nice, it's in the hotel room in which the painter is painting this sequence, remembering and incorporating these women's lives. And outside the window is the red roof of the south of France. It's in the present of painting. It's the window that invites the painter to join, but she resists. And in fact, in the words of the Deuteronomy from the Mincha service and Yom Kippur, choose life, she chooses life. She's also telling, I very briefly think about this question of how does she become an artist? She becomes an artist in the Third Reich. History ends her childhood. We have this dramatic inscription of the moment of the 30th of January 1933, with all the noise and the shouting and the street noises of the paramilitary processions of the SA, the noise of breaking glass, the assault on shops, and the reading of the horrific anti-Semitic Die Stürme. And then she decides to become an artist. This is where it links with what Kerry was saying. She went to art school as the only Jewish child in her young woman in the class. She was allowed in for a variety of reasons. We're not quite sure, but there are evidence that they thought she was so withdrawn she would not be a threat to the Aryan men. She would not attract them in any way. And we have here a manifesto, which has on the left-hand side the world of illustration and nature into which she was introduced, partly by Ernst Böhm, but by Professor Bartnung, who you see here in the class, who loved them to go into nature, draw flowers, and tell German fairy tales. And this is rejected on behalf of her allegiance that she's declaring here to modern art. As you can see, the sunflowers and the boots are of Van Gogh. The apples and the distorted jug reference Cézanne. And at the same time, this this narrative space with different kinds of events is drawn clearly from Chagall. But all of those artists are going to be collected in a single exhibition called Entartete Kunst, as they are deaccessioned from the museums, sold to make money for the Nazi project. And this exhibition took place in 37 to 38. It even came to, this is the catalogue, it even came to Berlin. Now, whether she went, we think it's possible that she would have received this paradoxical gift from Hitler of the first international survey of all of modern art. This is the place from which I think she drew much of her resources. And she clearly marks the sort of Arno Brecher Nazi notion of the great masculinity against the Matissean dancing figures. She shows her allegiance. And my argument is her allegiance is declaring herself as a Jewish artist, because by allying herself with modernism, which is declared entauteter, in degenerate in the same terms that the Jewish world was being declared, she is being not just modern, but saying she is a Jewish artist, affiliating herself to this. Then comes the Angriff, the Pogromnacht, which is also represented in her work. So history periodically erupts with noise and violence. And then we have the agony, and I'm almost finished here, of leaving. And I think that's so significant that she shows this amazing thing, which so many people like Marion Kaplan have done. What was the agony of departure? What is it to go into exile? There are 16 paintings by which she tracks every slow, ghastly step to the point at which she's in the train. And when she's in the train, we see the train rushing away in the Anhalter Bahnhof, with the two people, the teacher and the singer, saying farewell as the couple that leaves her. She has another version of it in which she crosses everything out, but you'll just see what she remains in the window. And if we come very close up here, you can see the agony of almost stretching out the window. Do not let me go, I cannot leave. So this is put in, and then we have this moment of reflection, which draws from a cinematic reference of Queen Christina by Mamoulian, which was released in Germany in 1934, and she did go to the cinema. This allies Charlotte Salomon with the Freuds and the late work of Freud, which is an analysis of the 1930s, and it puts her in the company of Freud, Walter Benjamin, and Hannah Arendt. In the end, she starts painting by the sea. She says, from all of this she has told us, life or theatre came, but what indeed it was involving was she starts the beginning. She goes back to why does a woman die? So it's a detective work about what happened in that house which led this woman to escape. It's situated in political time and places, and it offers, I suggest, a unique and monumental challenge to our understanding the lives and tragedies of Jewish women in Germany over 3 generations and in catastrophic historical circumstances. In the final painting, she's beginning her travel back into time. She's not a narrative, she's investigating from the present to the past to understand how she arrived in the present. And this work, there are no question marks. So I hope that I've given you some sense of how this artist created a work which now should give her a name, except the name is CS. She hides her ethnicity, her religion, and her gender by signing her pictures only with her initials. So in my book, I think the artist is CS, the historical person is Charlotte Salomon, and between the two, we have to keep a separation in this. So thank you for listening.
So Griselda, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. We had talked about how we would ask some questions of each other, and Michael will join us to pose some questions from the audience as well at some point. So maybe one thing that you can do for us after sort of reviewing all of the different things that Leben, oder Theater does as this magnificent artwork is tell us a little bit about how we should understand it in terms of genre. You talked about how it incorporates operatic and cinematic elements, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more specifically how she uses music and voice and image and text and the interplay of all of these different elements to create a story. How does she do that? And in your estimation, in your reading?
Thank you very much. I think that's a great question. It defies genre. That's the problem. Nobody knows what we're looking at. And it can't be fitted into, I don't think it's sort of a proto-comic novel. I don't think it's a proto-graphic novel. I think her training is to think between a very serious kind of illustration of complex stories and types and characters and painting as she sees it, Matissean painting, Van Gogh painting. Why Munch and Van Gogh are important, because it's about psychological painting, painting about states of mind. That's what she's also doing. But it clearly is drawing on the two key things. One is opera, in which people have to make decisions. All opera is about the sort of fate encapsulating people, and then they sing through it to explore the meaning of it. And often it's about women who will end up, I mean, opera mostly kills women, not Mozart, thank goodness, but most women characters die in opera. It's a complicated problem. But at the same time, it's cinema. Imagine what it was like to be an artist at the beginning of the century when there was suddenly this entirely new art form. And it's not just, you know, entertainment movie. These are the great German expressionist films, the great filmmakers who come from the theatrical traditions of Reinhardt and Brecht and things like that. So I think we have to accept that way. So she says she was humming all the time, and she says tunes came into the head and there's a relation. So I think this is a really crucial part, which is why whenever I present, I make sure people hear the acoustic envelope. And, you know, the painful lament of Orpheus and then the Bis du bei mir, these are key things. There's Bizet, she has a little bit of that for the Toreador, for Abbot Damelone. It's the sound of her stepmother singing. And her mother was a pianist as well. So music is a cue into the relationships that are there and lost.
One thing that I'm really interested in, and you showed a couple of images of the text in the work. What does it mean to paint pages full of text? I guess I'm still sort of grappling with this as a scholar of literature and trying to figure out what to do with that in this genre-defying work. What does it mean to read a painting that is words? How do we get at interpreting that?
I think what she did is she started painting, right? And then when she says, I can't remember at that memory page, I can't remember really where this all came from. Why were the tunes? Why were those things? So then I think she lays these overlays, and she has most of the prologue, the prelude has these overlays. And on that, she has both painting, you know, like sort of that design I showed you. And then there's a kind of chorus, and sometimes there's dialogue. So she's actually making her sort of storybook, you know, in a certain kind, not for a film. It is operatic in that sense, because they're often in dialogues and duets and things like that, with indications to the sound to which it. So sometimes I used to try singing those texts to the various sounds. This was ghastly for the public because I can't sing at all. So I gave that one up quite quickly, etc. But it is that sense of entering a space which is of the visual space, the depth of created space in a painting, the acoustic space she brings with it, but there is this necessity of the speech. So it's not literature, because it's not writing in that sense. And you're absolutely right. There are, I think, 19 pages of this painted letter. And so I think she was beginning to think that was, and so some bits are written very, you know, she's doing it very fast. And others are very carefully planned out, you know, through this very regular lettering. So I think that did come from her illustration exposure in art school, that words are an element of design, as you showed in the illustration. So it's not literature, it's not handwriting, it's they become themselves. And she uses different colors for the words. So there's also a color movement in her paintings. But, you know, you can see she integrates word and image as well.
That's really great. Maybe we can come back to some of the discussions that we've already started about art history. And you've given us so much to think about in your book, and also today in your presentation, thinking about how Salomon might fit into the history of art in terms of the history of modern art, or modernism as we know it. And you also come to us as a leading scholar of feminist interventions in art history. So what elements of your work on the absenting of women and the indifference to gender in mainstream art history have come into your have come into your approach to this artist? Sort of what did you bring in from all of your other previous scholarship to your study of Charlotte Salomon?
Thank you very much for that question. And thank you for stressing this thing of absenting. I think we are constantly thinking that somehow one's recovering lost artists, whereas everywhere you look in the history of the 20th century are women working side by side with men. Every little group, every little thing, big organizations. This is the era of emancipation and of professionalization of women. How come the telling of the story of modern art from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which became the paradigm for it, through to German art history, Haftmann is the same. How come you could absent women in their presence? Right? It's not that you have to dig up some 16th century artist. Oh, by the way, we'll bring her back. It's actually everybody. You go to any studio, they're there side by side. And this is a collective modern operation. So I am critiquing this question of how did art history, museal and academic consistently misinform us about the nature of modernity as co-created by men and women, Jewish and non-women, and from all over the world. If you go to Paris, there's just everybody there. 30 Chinese women students, women artists from Shanghai arrive in the early 30s, right? This is not one or two, substantial, okay? So that means you don't have to argue the case. You have to turn it back on art history. How could you do this? What's going on? Why has art been masculinized in the century of women? This is a big question. So when I come to look at Charlotte Salomon, I was driven, I came across it in the 1990s in the context of Catherine de Seger preparing an exhibition called Inside the Visible, which was looking at the 20th century with women in mind and looking at the radicalness of the 1920s, the beneficiary of which, Shalit is of that generation. There's a huge women's cultural revolution going on and participation. Then the rise of fascism kills that dead. And there's this gap, which, there's a wonderful prayer we use in our synagogue, think of all the laughter and love that was lost, all the wit, all the intelligence because of this mass murder in the middle of the century, which scattered people to the world and left them in exile and unable to carry on in certain things because they caught up with them. And then in the 1960s and 70s, we sort of recover this, but we've had this history wiped out because they never told us about the 20s. They didn't say to, Lee Krasner, what about, Rahel Szalit? That's disappeared, and she disappeared. I wasn't taught that in the 1970s. I didn't, I had to dig back to even the 1950s, and Lee Krasner didn't die till 1984. Helen Frankenthaler, 2003 or 4 or 5, right? These are extraordinary things, etc. So we mustn't think we're recovering forgotten. They were absented, and there was a masculinization of art history. And so when I came to Charlotte Salomon, I wrote 3 manuscripts. The first was with everything that I'd done so far, just plopped on top of her. And then I realized that would not see her. I would not see her. If I had to start from things that I don't know. So then I had to mobilize exactly this whole range of feminist rethinking about, subjectivity. Then at the same time, Jewish cultural studies took off, right? Without that whole kind of appropriate moving from Jewish studies from kind of theology and history into cultural studies, into sort of whole different kind of perspective that blossomed in the 1990s. I mean, the first ever panel at CAA, which is the College Art Association, that dared to raise the question of Jewishness in art history was 1998. And the first conference I went to about Jewishness and modernity was a conference in London in 1996, right? So this whole question suddenly made it possible. And how would I hold these things in their mind? And exactly as you're asking, what makes her a Jewish woman is not because she was born into a Jewish family. It's because she affiliated herself with resistance through her, appropriation of various outsiders. Munch and Cézanne and Van Gogh are the strange outsiders, and the work of a lot of Jewish directors and artists and all these sort of in that particular moment. Billy Wilder's making his mention am Sonntag right there in Weimar, Berlin, and things. So I had to, as it were, have this double re-education. One, I had to build a whole feminist artifice and then challenge it, and not just simply impose it on her. The work resists it. Engage with this whole development of Jewish cultural studies, and also go through, my own education in terms of becoming a teacher of Holocaust studies and exploring the question of representation and trauma. So it took the first, I threw away. The second, I also despaired with, and it took me 16 years to actually write this, to arrive at a manuscript that I thought just began to approach the complexity of that work with these feminist questions, rather than fitting her into. It's what kind of world are these characters that she produced? What did they represent as they plot out what it was like to grow up in that situation? And that's why I keep saying bereavement, social death, exile, and then also, as you know from my book, I think there's an issue of sexual abuse. And this is what she discovers is potentially, so it's like a detective work. So I had to draw on a whole lot of different things, find out a lot about opera, find out a lot about cinema, find out a lot about Jewish experience in the 1930s as it's documented. So it is a transdisciplinary project, not an attempt to integrate her into an art history which has no place. Right? I don't want her to be a Holocaust artist. I don't want her to be a Jewish artist. I don't want her to be a woman artist. I want this work in its monumental, envisioning of engagement with these predicaments to be examined and rethought rather than categorized. And that's why I resist the idea that it's autobiography or that it's narrative. It's got two question marks. It's interrogating. Do I choose life or do I choose death? It's like Deuteronomy.
Well, that's a perfect transition in a way to some of the questions that have been posed. And I thank you both for an extremely engaging conversation, and both your slide presentations were highly illuminating. And I think we learned a lot from them, and has maybe encouraged some of the questions. Well, one of them comes back to what you were talking about before, Griselda, regarding to what extent do you introduce biography into a reading of an artistic production?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, how do you gauge when and how to introduce the biography of an artist into their work, into an assessment of their work? And that's for.
May I answer that, Kerry? That's okay. Okay. We all live lives, right? Most of us don't know what the life we've lived. We've got certain kinds of memories. We can go to our diaries. We can say what it is. And since a biography isn't something you have, it's the product of living. So Nietzsche talks about this, which is the minute I stop and look back and write my biography, I no longer am the subject of it. That's a big philosophical question. So how do you integrate it? Now, Lee Krasner, for instance, says, you just need to know my biography and you'll understand my paintings. Try that out. Go and look at sort of big abstract paintings and say, that's all about. No, this is not things. It's, and I think in the particular thing, the problem is the biographical reductionism. If we reduce people to a biographical fact, we seem to have to say, oh, she did this because, or this was who she was, and therefore her art expresses it. Actually, art has to produce a form of the representation of experience. It semioticizes and rhetoricizes experience in such a form that you then say, oh, that's maybe what it was, right? So I always start with this thing, which is, I don't introduce it. Obviously, there are certain events and there are certain sequences and there are certain frameworks we use. So somebody's just asked me what the dates of the paintings of Charlotte Salomon. 1940 to 41, she's painting it in between 6 or 18 months. She's painting every day they're all virtually of the same date. And then she goes back and puts it into order and frames it and gives it a title and all these various elements of it. So, but the question I'm interested, if they reduce it to Charlotte Salomon, she just might as well have just painted a whole series of self-portraits, but she doesn't. She says these are characters. And if you read it, and Kerry, you'd appreciate this obviously in sense from literary studies, there's obviously an element consciously and unconsciously goes into it, but you create these characters to play out something through which you then learn what it is that you are trying to give a form to, shape and understand. So even if I tell you my biography, I've only discovered the meaning of the fact I was born in South Africa. I went to Canada, I lived in French Canada, I came to English Canada, I'm an immigrant in England, I did this and I did that. That acquires meaning only through what I do with it, or what I say about it, or even the story I tell about it, which may be one thing today, another thing tomorrow, because I don't know my own story. But somebody could put it together and it would be an interpretation. So there's a huge literature about what is a biography. So that's why I say you stick with the work. What is it saying? What is it doing? What can I read? What else do I bring to it to make it, to allow it to shock me or surprise me, rather than I know already there's this poor tragic woman and these are all this, here she is and this is her and she's not. It's not. Why would she make something as complicated as this and make everybody sing? It's obviously dynamic, but not reductive. And most things that happen with women artists, like with Louise Bourgeois, everybody reduces this great abstract sculptor to a sad story. And I don't think she knew that sad story when she made her work. She discovered it very late, and then she had to deal with the trauma of what arose in a way, but artistically, not by making this artwork express it.
Kerry, thank you, Griselda.
Well, one thing I would just add to that, in literary studies, we of course also grapple with the famous concept of the death of the author, separating an author's biography from the work. But one thing that I really came to understand as I did more and more work in Jewish studies was that there's sort of a little bit of an exception in terms of thinking about Jewish contexts. Oftentimes, the way that we might understand or read a work is informed. We've already talked about how dates sometimes help us place or understand a work, and we need to know the date. And we think about the artist or the author's background and also connections to Jewishness. And I think, at least in Rahel Szalit's case, we think about an artist who was so profoundly informed by her position. And she was also received as such as an artist, someone coming from Eastern Europe, that certainly we can find works of hers that don't incorporate anything related to Eastern Europe, but in some cases we do. And so to me, one of the really interesting things is the way that people at the time also received her work and thought about her in that context, and even mapped autobiographical or rather aspects from her biography onto her works, saw in Die Emigrantin als Bardame, the immigrant woman as barmaid, they even understood that to be some kind of self-portrait or image of a Russian woman, for example, whereas that's not at all what she had necessarily declared it to be. So that sort of misreading that can happen when we imply too much about the biography of the creator of a work. But it does, to me at least, open up these other questions of how artists might connect to other artists or other traditions or other pasts, experiences, concepts that all connect within Jewish studies, within Jewish art or Jewish visual culture or literature, whatever, what have you. So I, at least in my work on Shalit, I'm thinking about that a lot.
Yeah, I wonder, thank you. I wonder whether, you both kind of talk about the influences on both of Charlotte Salomon and Rahel Szalit, what influence do you think they had, if any? Maybe we'll start with you, Kerry. Can you see any connections between the work of Rahel Szalit and some of the people who came after her or were contemporaries?
That's a great question. One of the things that I do know is that there was a conversation happening between Szalit and some of the artists she was working with in the early 1920s, especially Steinhardt and Meidner, who I mentioned. And I do think that they may have been influencing each other at that point, working in tandem or visiting each other's studios, showing each other work. And by the late 1920s, I see Szalit sort of running in slightly different circles with the Association of Women Artists in Berlin. And I think that there absolutely was a mutual reception and influence between works of the women involved in that organization. And I think that Szalit had an impact on those who were interested in her work at the time. She was written into art historical surveys in the 20s, and even sort of included, certainly up until her departure from Germany, and even a little bit after that, in the sort of the history of, or the cultural study being written at the time of German Jewish culture. She was part of that. And with Szalit, it seems as if her murder in the Holocaust really did sort of end the immediate treatment of her work, and so much of it was destroyed and so much of it was lost. So it's really hard to think about reception and influence beyond that point. I do think some of her illustrated books have been in circulation for a number of decades, and people have been here and there sort of encountering them and reading them and using them, and perhaps gaining inspiration from them. But I think that at this point, it is a matter of sort of excavating, finding her work in the archives, bringing it out, because it's not available to so many people who might wish to take inspiration from it. So it's a bit of a different project than Salomon, whose master artwork did survive.
Well, thank you. Griselda, would you like to comment on that question?
Yes, indeed. I think the question of, the first question with Charlotte Salomon, I'm sorry, I'm getting very hot. I look like kind of gone pink here. Charlotte Salomon's work was completely unknown. It went to the family in 46 because the woman to whom it was dedicated, Ottilie Moore, for some reason didn't want it. They didn't know what it was. They showed it to Otto Frank, who said, well, I'm not sure what this is either, because it's not like he was interested. He was just about to publish his daughter's diary. They then finally got in 1961, the head of the Modern Art Museum in Amsterdam to have a look at it. They gave them this rather sort of funny show off-site. And then it sort of went, nobody wanted it. It went to the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. Two people who were, it was a tiny thing. It just had, obviously very, very much post-war kind of thing. And they'd spend weeks trying to put it back together again to work out what this was. And the sort of history of that coming into being is a very slow kind of sense of her having every impact. So when people say, could she have any influence? I think now there's a whole generation of people who are really interested in taking it in all sorts of different directions. There was one question, could it have influenced Tracy Emin? I know Tracy Emin saw the show in 1998 in Royal Academy. Every artist who sees it or anybody who sees it is just blown away. It's just so remarkable in a sense. But that ordinary sense of influence, I don't think it can have that, because up until this, I'd say the influences, people have written ballets, they've done operas, everybody wants to reenact it, including David Fokinos and his dreadful novels. They want to reenact it, they want to appropriate her. They identify with this figure that they create, and some people even sort of imagine plays which take her to Auschwitz, which I think is not suitable. But I don't think it's so much for me the influence. It's important is, what was it that this moment and this artist did that we should study and come to understand. And that's why I said at the end, this is telling us something. And I think Darcy Berkeley, who's the historian who wrote a lot about the epidemic of suicide in the Jewish bourgeoisie, the beginning of the 20th century, and particularly amongst women. And this is what matters, is what she testified to brilliantly and ironically and fun. And I think that's a legacy more than a sort of stylistic influence. I don't know if that answers your question in a way.
Well, I hope it does, because somebody posed that question from the Q&A, and you probably saw it.
I mean, art history always teaches you everybody's influencing anybody, but they're not. Somebody looks back and says, "Oh, that's really interesting." It maybe resonates, it doesn't resonate, and then does something transformative, right? But this whole story that Cubism, Seurat influenced Cubism influenced somebody else influenced somebody else is just out of date. It's gone. We don't do that anymore. That's not the way art functions. And indeed, even Harold Bloom and the Anxiety of Influence says it's a battle, it's a combat, it's a struggle for identity against the father. Well, I don't think women struggle identity against the father, but now we're giving them a whole lot of other women artists to imagine this is a world in which I'm not alone. I think that's there's something to draw inspiration from.
Well, if there are no more, if there aren't any questions that perhaps you'd like to address briefly, we can maybe say farewell and thank you to you both.
Can I just say one thing? I've been
Yes.
answering the questions in the chat.
Yeah.
As we've gone along, because there are some very interesting questions, etc. But I think I'd just like to say what's so interesting is about to take away from it that somebody like Rahel Szalit could come from Lithuania, like Chagall came from not quite the Lubavitcher rabbis, it's just he's from that that particular Hasidic community, or Chaim Tsutin could come. And they could go to art school in Moscow, they could come to Paris, they could go to Germany, they could come, and then there was an organization and there was this great consciousness of women. And I mean, Germany, I've just been working on a historian called Helen Rosenau, who was a German Jewish art historian who was forced into exile. But, who does she reference? She references Gertrude Simmel, she reckons like Marianne Weber was infinitely more famous than, not Anton Weber, the which one is the sociologist? I'm sorry, but and the question of women was absolutely central. There was major feminism in Germany that made it possible. And then what you get with Charlotte Salomon, as you get with Anna Frank, suddenly we lost millions of the creative women at that point. And then because the culture is exploded, we don't know where that could have gone. What these women, had they been the foundations, like Käthe Kollwitz was the first head of the Prussian Art Academy, right? What would have happened if she was there looking over, and that Charlotte Salomon became a teacher there? She came back from exile, and all of these things. This is the catastrophe, this break. And art history never recognizes that culture was so shattered by fascism and the genocide in the middle of things. You can't have a running system. You have to acknowledge the gap and mourn that gap. And then my generation had to emerge as feminists with all of that history kind of disappeared. There was a sort of silence. They didn't say this has actually had an effect on culture in a way. So I would like us to keep the sense of going back and retrieving and rethinking that connection. And there will be isolated instances. And like, Szalit coming back, we suddenly think, how much did we not know? How much have people failed to tell us? How much will this change our world once we realize the creativity of women at the heart of modernity was absolutely normal at that time?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for mentioning Helen Rosenau. I remember her well from the British Library. and the
Oh,
Leo Baeck Institute in London. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody. And again, thank you, Griselda and Kerry, and our dear friends from the Leo Baeck Institute and Carnegie Hall for making this conversation and the two presentations such a success. Thank you so much, and hope to see you again soon.
Yep, indeed. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Kerry, for your questions and for revealing so much about Rahel Szalit to me. I really have gained a lot and really wonderful.
And thank you so much for everyone, to everyone for organizing. Thank you so much for Griselda for this wonderful conversation today. We learned so much, all of us, I think.